So first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the GTIVE webinar today. We're going to be talking about a really important topic called around Alzheimer's disease prevention with food and lifestyle. This is a really important topic because it's not the sort of thing that we think about really until it's potentially too late. And we've invited Martina, who will be hosting the webinar today, and she's going to be sharing a little bit more about a little bit more about Alzheimer's disease to start with, and then how you can adapt your food and lifestyle practically to go and improve the quality of life in your later years. So really excited, and to start with, we'll just introduce GTIVE. It's this webinar is hosted by GTIVE, and we are an educational platform. We connect students and teachers, and the whole idea is that we want to bring the best tutor in the field for you. So without any ado, I will hand it over to Martina, and we can make a start.
Okay. Can you switch to the next slide? Perfect. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay.
So a little bit of housekeeping quickly. We have got the Q&A and notes section that you can use to ask questions throughout the webinar, and please feel free to type away.
Okay. So I'll kick off now. So the webinar will be around 40-45 minutes, and everybody will be on mute. Yeah, and as Bobby just said, questions in the notes options. Well, a few things about me. Really, my motivation, my passion for brain health is really driven by the fact that I had a neurodegenerative autoimmune condition, and that essentially means my immune system was attacking my brain cells, and with that, my brain function went down really badly. And I am essentially back to life to function using a functional medicine approach, which means very much an approach to reinstate the function of the human body without pharmaceuticals. Probably I should just explain a bit functional medicine versus conventional medicine. So conventional medicine is really the medicine that we know, and that is the guys in the white coat and the stethoscope, and they look at you, the patient, and they will take, based on the symptoms, they will prescribe pharmaceutical interventions and manage symptoms with that. The functional medicine approach is same starting point, looking at a patient and his symptoms, and then working with the patient back on his timeline as to what the life events were that will likely have contributed to the manifestation of these symptoms. Then identifying what is really the core of that, eradicating those factors, and subsequently supporting the body, the patient, back to optimal function, back to health, with by really reinstating any deficiencies or imbalances, and with that a very sustainable health. And that was the approach I took inadvertently before I understood that that was actually a field. And then when I was better, I actually studied that for a master, and that is personalized nutrition with a very specific focus on avoidance and regeneration, if you will, of chronic illness. And here I'll just mention, based on that, I've started a startup project, an AI tool that will give a user very tailored guidance on food and lifestyle interventions to make in order to improve, maintain their brain health, and reduce their risk for Alzheimer's in the future. So very similar concept to what we'll be talking about here, but that will be a very convenient tool in one place. Overall, my aim for this webinar is really to empower you, to leave you with a strong sense of empowerment that Alzheimer's is not an inevitable consequence of aging, very importantly, and to really inspire you to take responsibility for your own health, in the sense that you have the power over your own health. You don't need to ask somebody else how you are. You can, by the choices you make in terms of food and lifestyle, drive your own health. And I think that is a very important realization to have and to live by. As mentioned, the structure of the webinar is really all about high level, what is the disease, prevalence of the disease, but most importantly, really, the nutrition and lifestyle interventions that we can all make in order to improve, maintain our brain health, and to prevent Alzheimer's in later years. I'll give a bit of an insight of my project, and at the end, some further resources that for you, lucky ones who get hooked and want to know more, there are some excellent books out there. Next slide, please. And actually, next as well. Right. So Alzheimer's dementia. I will use a few medical terms, so I'll just mention a few medical terms. So I'm not going to go into crazy details, but it's really all about, you will have heard certain terms, but likely you will not necessarily have a structure of what they mean, where they fit into this whole concept. And I'll try to give you a bit of a structured view of the whole thing. So Alzheimer's dementia itself is an incredibly complex disease. The symptoms of Alzheimer's, or really any dementia, are progressive loss of memory, cognition, and executive function. So that really means ability to remember things, to understand things, and to live independently. And that is, of course, absolutely terrible to lose oneself. And that is really what dementia is. The biomarkers of Alzheimer's is specifically in the brain. So biomarkers are the things that the neurologist can see on the MRI, on the brain scan. And based on that, he will diagnose, or she, that it is Alzheimer's dementia. And these two biomarkers are amyloid beta plaques and tau tangles. And these are words that you may have heard when reading about Alzheimer's. The disease is very complex, but the risk factors are as well. There are a great number of risk factors that you may not even be aware of, because they don't seem to be connected to brain health at all. So I'll just try to alert you a little bit to a few things here and there that you may not even have thought about. Alzheimer's is really fundamentally a lifestyle disease, so lifestyle as in includes food choices. So there is a genetic driver, but it's really fundamentally a lifestyle disease. And very importantly, when I say highly complex disease, it is a highly varied disease as well, in that every Alzheimer's patient is different. They're all essentially the same once the disease has progressed, in that the symptoms of dementia are in detail different, but overall the same with these patients. And the biomarkers, so amyloid beta and tau, as mentioned before. But what is very, very complex is there are 3 or even 5 different types of Alzheimer's in terms of the disease mechanism. So 3 or 5 different, depending on which neurologist you follow. So it is an emerging field of going into that sort of detail, as opposed to looking at it as one disease, which it is clearly not. So highly complex. In the middle there, you see 3 brain scans, and I think that is a very powerful view. On the left, you see the normal brain, and the middle and the right one are really ones that are already severely affected. So you can see that the gray matter really has atrophied, has disappeared, so there are actually holes in the brain. And that is definitely something we want to avoid, which is why we're on this one. And next slide, please. So, as mentioned, highly complex risk factors as well. And I will not go into every single one of them. A few very important things are really the differentiation between early onset and late onset Alzheimer's. Late onset is really the majority. I think 95% of all Alzheimer's cases are late onset. That is really from the age of 65 onwards. Early onset is really age 45. That is quite a different disease process, and that is driven by 3 genes, and so very, very much more rare. And these 3 genes, as a side note, are really carried by Down syndrome patients in 3 copies, because they have 3 copies of chromosome 21. So that is something very rare. That is funnily enough mentioned here on this picture that I used here. So we're talking about late onset. On the top right corner where it says family history, there to mention very important, 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are female. And that's really driven by menopause, where the estrogen level drops. And estrogen is incredibly important in the formation and in retention of memory. So it makes absolute sense, I think, for any female above the age of 40 to have an in-depth conversation with their doctor and endocrinologist, so or hormone doctor, if you will, about HRT, so hormone replacement therapy, not only for the talked about menopause symptoms, but for potential support of brain function. HRT and Alzheimer's is a very hotly debated topic, but still very important to simply have that in mind. There are natural ways to support the estrogen levels as well, with foods like soy isoflavones and so on. That's a whole different ballgame, and we don't have enough time in this session. Important, really, on the bottom right of this green square is really comorbidities, and out of those, type 2 diabetes I definitely want to highlight, because type 2 diabetes is a very, very common illness by now. It's a classic lifestyle illness in that people simply consume too much sugar, and with that, the body simply is not able to transport the sugar from the bloodstream into the cells. Now, type 2 diabetes is the inability of the body to utilize the glucose from the bloodstream, the sugar from the bloodstream. Type 3 diabetes is that in the brain, and that is Alzheimer's, the consequence of type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is reversible. Definitely incredibly important to focus on that. Alzheimer's is reversible, highly complex, and you will need a one-to-one relationship with a neurologist who will take you by the hand 24/7, and that is very, very, very hard still, and certainly not a guaranteed outcome. So I would urge anyone to focus on health today. On the right-hand side, there are a few environmental factors, environmental toxins, quite a few heavy metals that end up in the brain. The brain is 60% fat, and any toxins, any heavy metal, anything like that is stored in fat cells. So we definitely don't want to have heavy metals in the brain. At the top there, you will see cadmium as one of the risk factors, and cadmium really gets into the brain from smoking cigarettes. So smoking cigarettes is not just a matter of lung disease and cardiovascular, but brain disease and Alzheimer's disease. So I think that is very important. Pesticides, glyphosate, and such things. And two things not mentioned here are mold. So if you live in a damp building, the toxins that are given off by mold are incredibly increasing risk incredibly much, and exhaust fumes from cars, planes. So that is another thing to keep in mind. So people living in a village live healthier. Anyway, next slide, please. So here we just have a high-level overview of the scale, the prevalence of the disease. So right now we have 50 million Alzheimer's cases globally. The WHO is predicting 150 in 2050. So quite a steep increase. As mentioned, Alzheimer's is very heterogeneous, so very varied. No two patients are the same. And I think it's quite logical that monotherapy, so one drug for all these very, very different patients, different cases, cannot work. And clinical trials for Alzheimer's drugs have been failing left, right, and center. There has been one drug approved that is highly contested and I would argue problematic. So relying on a pharmaceutical intervention in terms of treatment, cure, prevention, I would say is not realistically an option. The 5 drugs that are available are just managing symptoms a little bit, but the patient still goes downhill. But the silver lining is really that there's a large body of evidence that is showing that nutrition and lifestyle are actually highly preventative. But the amount of data is really very unstructured and not clearly understood or clearly delivered to the patient. Next slide, please. What the right nutrition and lifestyle really do is it has the ability to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's by over 40%, so very significant. Early prevention is key, so ideally 20 years before the age of onset, and so 45. I would argue it's never too late and it's never too early. Because after all, this nutrition and lifestyle that we're talking about here, that is healthy for the whole body, anytime, any stage in life. So this is not something that will decrease your risk of Alzheimer's but increase others. No, it's a general whole body experience of being a healthy person. So complex disease, we need a multifactorial approach. So we need to address all different aspects of the body. So here, heart, obviously, brain, the way we live, physically active, having connection. What I would add there very much is organs like kidney and liver need to be supported because they are, of course, essential in detoxification of the body. And we've talked about toxins before, how we're being transported out of the body. And the other organ that is one of my favorites, that is the microbiome. So that's the culture of commensal bacteria that we have in our small intestine, sometimes in the large as well. But so it's this bacteria of microbes, and there's a direct link between the gut and the brain. It's a bilateral link, so they communicate both ways. And happy gut means happy brain. So that's very. Next slide, please. So here, just a quick overview over the headlines that we've seen over time in the different papers or publications by the NHS, so the CDC, that Alzheimer's is preventable with food and lifestyle. It has been talked about quite a bit, but other than in the End of Alzheimer's program written by Dale Bredesen, there is no clear guidance anywhere. And that was really the basis of my project to get this vast amount of information into a very clear and executable, actionable messages to the patient or the person that does not want to become a patient. I think that's the most important thing. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through 100 items that you need to remember what to do, what not to do, what to have, to not to have, and so on. But I think it's very much about having a logical approach to what makes sense, what doesn't. So if you stick to a few simple rules, you'll go to the store and know what to have and what not, if you feel like it. So very important, I think, is to know the basics, to simply not get caught out by marketing, by messages that say low fat, and that's great, and no added sugar, for example. Low fat might likely indicate that there is a lot of sugar in there just to make up for the lack of taste. As mentioned, the brain is 60% fat, so we want to go high fat, high quality, high fat. That's very important. I'll go into that in a moment. No added sugar may very well mean natural sugars, and if it is white refined sugar or an organic mango, sugar is sugar is sugar, just to keep that in mind. And the next point I think is very important. Trust yourself and listen to your body. If you eat something and you feel foggy in the brain or sleepy, that's your body saying, I don't like it. So that's something to not ignore. And probably my favorite is to eat what your ancestors would have eaten. So if you know where you came from many generations ago, you will eat something that your body is adapted to, and that will make the life for your body much easier and make you happier, likely, because that will dampen inflammation. Next slide, please. Right, so nutrition to avoid inflammation. So I guess inflammation is another term that's been used a lot in relation to illness. And I think very important there is to differentiate between acute inflammation and chronic inflammation. So acute inflammation is really what happens if you cut yourself or you have a bruise or something, and that place on your body gets red and hot, and that is really the immune system is sending their inflammatory markers there, and the healing process begins. Very important, and that inflammatory reaction will die down when the inflammatory process has progressed. Chronic inflammation, on the other hand, is a very unnatural state to be in. And that is really when the body is constantly exposed to something that is foreign to the body, that the body just does not understand as something to eat or to metabolize, whatever it is. So it is something that the body recognizes as enemy and really upregulates immunity. And that happens when we eat foods that the body doesn't know, doesn't understand, doesn't like. And the whole list is important. But I'll start with gluten. That is something that has become a huge problem over time recently. Gluten is a protein in grains, but grains have been genetically modified so much that the gluten content is so much higher. And at the same time, gluten is used in the processed food industry as an ingredient to stabilize foods, to increase their shelf life, whatever it is. So with that, our gluten intake is incredibly high without us even knowing it. So I think it is very important to be aware of what's actually in stuff. Soy sauce, for example, contains gluten, which is something I will never get over. The next point, dairy, really, that is quite known. Many people are lactose intolerant. I would probably say, from my perspective, lactose is, or dairy is really meant for baby cow, sheep, and goat, not for adult humans. So it is not a surprise in that way that humans cannot really digest it. Humans don't have the enzyme lactase over the age of 10 usually to actually metabolize it. But I think, in my mind, really the crux of why dairy is so inflammatory is one of the proteins, casein. And casein is really highly inflammatory. Casein is, for example, implicated in acne, in skin inflammation, and very much in gut inflammation. And of course, an inflamed gut is an inflamed brain. So that's why we definitely want to make sure that we don't eat inflammatory foods, because we don't want to inflame our brain. The rest of the list you probably suspected: processed foods, ingredients that don't sound like foods, vegetable oils, so rapeseed, sunflower, peanut, canola, soy, all these liquid oils that are quite cheap, that are sold in huge canisters, that are very likely oxidized in production process, and with that, they are essentially will cause free radicals in the body, and with that, damage the cell structure. Very important to differentiate between vegetable oils, so these oils, and olive oil. Ideally, extra virgin olive oil. Have industrial amounts of that, because that's the kind of oil that the brain loves. So very much differentiate between the quality of oils, but vegetable oils avoid where you can. Sadly, usually in restaurants, vegetable oils are being used to fry and grill things. So just to keep that in mind, that is really why restaurants, especially the less high quality ones, are a bit problematic. Another thing you will have suspected: GMOs, so genetically modified foods, are problematic. Non-organic foods, because of the pesticides, which impact our microbiome, and with that impact the integrity of that culture of wonderful creatures that really drive our health. So always be kind to your microbiome. That, I think, is something to keep in mind. Artificial sweetness, diet foods, sugar-free foods, that in itself is a problem. So on the one hand, actual sugar, but artificial sweetness as well, have in some ways actually very similar problems, or cause similar problems in the human body. Just a side note here, stevia is not artificial. Stevia is from a plant. So stevia is, if something is sweetened with stevia, that is something that actually will not cause this cascade of inflammation and other unwanted side effects. The last thing to mention here is older fish. Omega-3 fatty acids, omega-3 oils are incredibly important for the brain, and the brain loves omega-3. But the older fish, so omega-3 is a fatty acid in fish. It's the perfect source. But ideally, these fish should be young, so not have been living in a soup of mercury and other crazy things for a long time. And tuna, swordfish, shark, if you eat that, are quite old fish. So when they're harvested, they've been living in a mercury-infested ocean for a long time. So if you can tolerate fish, if you like fish, have young fatty fish like mackerel, herring, salmon, sardines, that sort of thing. That's really ideal. And next slide, please. So now to what to actually feed your brain. After now, I've told you that there's pretty much nothing left. Well, there is a lot left. So the fat is really, fat intake is really absolutely central for brain health. And very important to keep in mind, it's not fat that we eat that makes us sick, that makes us fat, that causes cardiovascular problems. It is carbohydrates that cause heart attacks and strokes and all that. That's really based on in a scientific study that was done in the 50s or something that was falsified. So always keep in mind, high fat, high health, brain health. And of course, anyone who's on statins should have a conversation with their doctor. So I'm not telling you what to do. I'm trying to inspire you, just to make that clear. Foods to feed your brain, really nutrient-dense natural foods, ideally foods that you prepare at home, so you know what's actually in there. Green leafy vegetables are the classic. They're high in minerals. Very important here for the microbiome, fermented foods like yogurt, coconut milk yogurt, for example, kimchi, sauerkraut. So foods that have bacterial activity in them. That is very, very positive for the microbiome. As mentioned, never enough high quality fats, omega-3, extra virgin olive oil, coconut oil. Coconut oil is a saturated fatty acid, and that has had a very, very bad reputation, again, based on that study that was falsified. And by now, I think coconut oil and the one fatty acid from coconut oil is called MCT, medium chain triglycerides. You may have heard that in the biohacking context if you're ever there. That is incredibly positive for brain function. Nuts and avocados contain high fat as well. Colorful fruits, colorful vegetables, but very important to watch sugar content, especially tropical fruits, root vegetables, and they can be very high in sugar. So watch out for store-bought foods, short in list of ingredients. And the Mediterranean diet is possibly a term that you've come across. That is really a diet that is being consumed traditionally in the Mediterranean countries. That is very high in plant foods, colorful vegetables, lots of olive oil, some fish, and some fruit, certainly not pasta or industrial amounts of red wine. That's very important. So the Mediterranean diet is the very lovely light diet without the pasta. So that's very important. Next slide, please. So here I've listed a few classic, or rather, some deficiencies that are known for having a very detrimental effect on brain health. Vitamin D and K. So vitamin D is really produced by the body when sun hits the skin. I think it's UVB rays. And if we live in an area in the world or in a country where, like the UK, where there's never enough sun, and we will never be able to expose enough skin to really produce enough of our own vitamin D. It is very important to look into supplementation, sufficient supplementation, and vitamin D and K I mentioned here together. They are both fat solubles, and one is supporting the absorption of the other. So that these two are very, very important to have together. Vitamins A, C, and E, that is really very common in foods. And the B vitamins, I think in a brain context, might likely make sense to supplement with them. Make sure you have a chat with your doctor about that, ideally a functional doctor who will be much more precise in terms of optimal level versus the normal range, because the normal range is very wide. The optimal point is somewhere in that normal range. So B6, B9, B12 is equally important for degradation of a certain substance in the bloodstream that may build up and lead to Alzheimer's, but B12 for nerve function. Some minerals to focus on: magnesium, zinc, selenium. Of course, probiotics, not only, but especially after you have been taking antibiotics, because antibiotics kill bacteria indiscriminately. So they will kill the bad guys, but also the good guys that we have in our gut. And we want to keep our gut microbiome happy. So probiotics are absolutely central. And once more, the fatty acids, so omega-3 to omega-6 ratios should ideally be 1 to 2. In this world, it's more like 1 to 10. In the US, it's more like 1 to 20. So omega-6, just so you understand, so omega-3, fatty fish mainly. Omega-6 are those vegetable oils, but also extra virgin olive oil. So the vegetable oils we can avoid to some extent unless we go to a restaurant. But we can increase our omega-3 intake just to rebalance the ratio a little bit, to some extent at least. Next slide, please. Now, some lifestyle habits to drop. I think you probably suspected them. Smoking, as mentioned, cadmium in the brain. Alcohol in any amounts is a neurotoxin, so that's why the red wine on the Mediterranean diet is essentially a bit of a moot point. Sedentary lifestyle, being overweight, is of course correlated with type 2 diabetes that we definitely want to avoid. Sleep deprivation. During sleep time, the brain cleanses itself or tidies up itself from all the debris that has been accumulated during the day. It sounds a bit absurd, but that is really a process that is happening only in sleep. So that's why sleep is so important. Chronic stress, anger, all these states a human can be in that are just a very high cortisol, high stress, and that are in itself inflammatory. And of course, people that are toxic in their behavior, in their ways, are pro-inflammatory in that way as well. Isolation and loneliness has been shown to be incredibly detrimental to the human mind. Humans are just social animals, so being around people is incredibly important. And lack of intellectual stimulation is probably related to that, but the mechanism there is, and I find that incredibly interesting, it's called cognitive reserve. So a person that has had higher education or has a very curious mind and has a very, very dense brain of synapses, if you will, is much more protected from Alzheimer's disease, because there is so much more that the disease might destroy before symptoms show up. At least that's how I visualize it in my mind. Next slide, please. Lifestyle habits to consider. So I very much try to use the wording things to consider rather than things you have to do or have to stop, because that, of course, I don't want to create resistance with you. It's very much about you feeling empowered by simply knowing things that you can do, and over time you might just want to try it out. So exercise, obviously, we keep hearing about that. There are different pathways, different mechanisms there. I think very important is, on the one hand, of course, oxygen that is increased to the brain, but also detoxification. So by moving, we get our lymphatic system to be much more active, and sweating is a perfect way to detoxify. And it reduces inflammation. So in that way, it's a great thing to do. Even walking is considered exercise, so that's a good start. Sleep, very important, as mentioned. Consistent timing, blue light avoidance, so a laptop in the bedroom, definitely not a good idea. Manage stress with yoga, with whatever works for you. fasting is a very interesting thing. You may have heard about that a lot. 16-8, for example, or simply ad hoc fasting, to give the brain and the gut 16 hours of peace, if you will, where there's no digestion, there's no work going on, but the gut can essentially heal the gut lining in these hours. So in that way, it is a very important process, considering that we know gut-brain connection, so we want to keep the gut happy, the gut as an organ, and also the microbiome that's living in the gut, in the organ. Something else, probably quite obvious, to keep learning, to stay curious, to keep using one's mind and brain, is incredibly important. Find your community and purpose. As mentioned, we are social creatures, and I think something very important that just struck me is trauma is very often shown in a physical manifestation, a person being overweight or having some other ailments. So psychological therapy for trauma may actually be a hugely healing process. So just as a side note. Next slide, please. Right, so here, just a bit of an overview, lifespan versus health span. So while in many countries people live longer, their health span, so the healthy time of their life, gets shorter. And what we, of course, want a longevity, but a long health span as well. So, and there are a number of things that are indicative of a good health, long-term health. So digestion, metabolic health, so that is very much blood pressure, cardiovascular health, weight, insulin resistance or the ability of the body to transport glucose from the sugar from the bloodstream into cells. So not to have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. Having consistent energy levels, consistent moods, healthy circulation, so no cold hands, which I usually have. And having strong muscles, connective tissues, and strong bones. As a side note, their bone health has been for a long time milk has been marketed as being very good for bone health for a long time. Actually, studies have been showing now for quite a while that women that consume a lot of milk have very, very poor bone mineralization. So the calcium in dairy is not bioavailable, so that actually has a detrimental effect on bones. So that's something that might even inspire you more to avoid dairy. So and probably a very interesting insight into your own health is really to understand the health conditions of your parents and grandparents, because there is always a bit of a hereditary effect to it. Next slide, please. My project. So I called it Let's Make AD History. So let's make Alzheimer's disease history. So the idea is really that let's make history as in let's do something that has never been done before, but let's make Alzheimer's disease history, i.e. happened in the past, so it doesn't exist anymore. And that's, of course, a very, very optimistic approach, but I think that's how we need to be in order to actually change something. The project is really an AI tool, so an artificial intelligence tool that will give the user, based on the user profile they have signed up with, tailored guidance on food and lifestyle, what to have, what to avoid. And so that is then quite specific to the user. Of course, it can never be absolutely personalized, because for that, there would have to be a one-to-one relationship with a neurologist who really can test them head to toe. But this is the step between the generalized message of Alzheimer's is preventable with food and lifestyle versus then seeing the neurologist and paying £10,000s for that, if you're lucky, and if you can find somebody. So with that project, I am currently at a stage of crowdfunding for the MVP, for the minimal viable product. And it would be wonderful if you would get involved to progress that. I put down here my Instagram and Facebook handles, so you can follow me and communicate with me. There is here my email address, letsmake80history@gmail.com. So please email me or direct message me with any thoughts that you have on future webinars that you would like to have. So I've been thinking about one specifically on fats, on sleep, on toxic things in our environment, in our apartment, in our house, that we can avoid if we only know how detrimental they are. And next slide, please. So that's now the last slide. So that's the further resources that I've mentioned. The books here, the 3 books, are, I think, absolutely amazing. The first one, At the End of Alzheimer's, is written by Dale Bredesen, who is the coolest neurologist there is. He very much came up with this concept that Alzheimer's is preventable, and he has been working with over 100 patients by now, and to return them from manifested Alzheimer's very much with loss of memory, cognition, function, and reinstated them back in life with the food and lifestyle interventions. The next book, The Grain Brain by David Perlmutter, is my personal inspiration. Obviously, grain, gluten on the brain is, for me, incredibly detrimental, and I would argue many people would benefit from reading that book and possibly taking on his thoughts. The third one is very specifically for the female brain, The XX Brain by Lisa Mosconi. She is very much a researcher into the female brain. Male and female brains are organically the same, but functionally very different because of the hormonal changes that females go through. So that book is incredibly insightful, incredibly helpful. There are a number of great podcasts. I listened some there. And if you really, really want to dive into things, go to pubmed.gov, and that is the global database of the most high quality scientific papers. And there you can read up on anything and everything. And this now concludes my webinar. Rushi, can you see the questions that came up?
Thank you. So I've got a question.
Okay.
And it's, with life being so busy and things being so chaotic, how have you got any tips for how we can be mindful of our lifestyle? Because there are loads of incredible ideas and recommendations you've given. I just don't know where to start.
Yeah, possibly a very good place to start is to simply make it a habit to notice how you feel after you eat something. I think that's really the first thing. So many people tell me that they feel funny about something, but they never actually make the connection. Eating bread makes them feel bloated, slow, irritated, whatever it is. So possibly that's the first thing to do, to not actually change anything yet, but really on the route to understanding yourself, understanding your body, to notice how certain foods make you feel. And if you're really, really aggressive, you may start to specifically notice how gluten makes you feel, or you could even start to reduce your gluten intake. But that's, that's just an idea.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I don't know if any of our attendees had any questions, but we've not got anything through, so we'll just give it a second. But yeah, it's fascinating. There's so much that we can do right now to prevent or reduce the chance of suffering in the future. And I think it's really important just being mindful of how you feel. That point around, just take a moment to check in with yourself and see if you do feel a little bit off after anything, whether it's something you've eaten or drank or situation scenarios you're in, etc. So that's really good. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us, Martina. So if anyone would like to find out more, please do reach out to Martina. She's listed as as well. So you might be able to book some time with her as well if you wanted to go into things a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. Or just direct message me, email me. I'd be very happy to answer your questions. I just had a few WhatsApp messages that people had trouble dialing in. So I hope we still had lots of people.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's we're gonna have to sort out for the next one, but we will get it sorted.
Okay. Yeah, there will definitely be another one. There are so many other topics that I've been asked about, so I'll be very happy to do another session. So thank you very much for having me.
I did get some really good feedback on WhatsApp as well. Someone saying it was really, really good. Thanks for that. He had to go, but he's definitely going to be making some changes to his diet as a result of it. So there we go. Awesome stuff. So with that, thank you, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Yes, thank you very much for that. All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Now.